Good morning. This is Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood. I am here with Tara Cardinal, who has been involved with the investigation of, I guess, a secondary investigation, to me, a more complete investigation of the case involving Anthony Sanchez, who is scheduled for execution on September the 21st, literally 6 weeks from today. And Tara wanted to come on and share some of what she's been looking into, what she's been doing. And Tara, if you could go ahead and give us a little introduction.
Hi, my name is Tara Cardinal, and I got involved with this case back in December when I was working with David Ballard on a completely unrelated matter. He was part of the campaign team for a judicial campaign that I was working on. And so in my travels, I'm also an author, as well as some of you might know me from some terrible movies that you might watch. A lot of horror movies that I've done. So I've been working on this book about domestic violence, and I believe I've cracked the code for it. And David Ballard, being a specialist in domestic violence and also an expert witness, I asked him to read what I've been working on and how it correlates to terrorism. And he liked it so much. Not only did he ask me to come teach at the school he's getting up and running, but he asked me to help him solve a murder. And I thought that was a little bit above my pay grade, but I figured, why not? I certainly can't do any harm. And then as I was going through the details of it, I realized a lot of it didn't make any sense. The narrative put forth by the prosecution didn't really fit the facts. But of course, that's their job. Well, I'm saying that wrong. The prosecution was given this DNA profile of who they thought was the killer. And when that profile came back matching Anthony Sanchez, it was their job to make all the other details of the case match with Anthony Sanchez. But if you take them apart individually, they don't. And that was deeply concerning to me, not just for the sake of Anthony Sanchez, but for the sake of Juli Busken, who is the primary victim in this crime. And what's really disturbing to me is this idea that there's this murderer maybe walking around free, having done this horrible thing, and he might be about to claim yet another victim, and I'm just not okay with that. That was a pretty long intro.
No, it's great. It's great. It's great. So, out of curiosity, what was the red flag? What was the biggest red flag that you encountered at first?
Well, the first thing was that Anthony had just turned 18 at the time of the murder. Oh gosh, there were so many things. And his criminal record didn't reflect that kind of violence at all. And normally when a person becomes violent, it's an escalation. You don't start off murdering. You start off with animals and you start off being abusive. And you just wake up 6 weeks after your 18th birthday. The other thing that was interesting was that he doesn't fit the incel profile at all. A lot of these men that you hear about in the news, they're going around murdering women because they don't have women in their lives. Anthony Sanchez was living with a girlfriend who was pregnant with his child at the time. So it's not like he didn't have somebody in his life. But what was more concerning to me was actually the details around the kidnapping. So I'm sure you've gone over this several times, but of course, Juli Busken was kidnapped on December 20th at approximately 5:30 in the morning, according to the 911 calls. So December 20th, she was way outside her pattern of life. She had just graduated from the University of Oklahoma, right? OU, that's Oklahoma University.
Right. University of Oklahoma, that's right.
Yeah, the thing is, I went to college, and when you don't graduate, nobody graduates in December. So I was like, that was interesting. She only went for 3.5 years. And what that tells me is that she took extra courses, but she was also a ballerina. And I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm not a dancer at all. but I did take ballet in college. Very briefly, I wasn't any good. But ballerinas, the real ones, they practice hours a day. And she also had a job at a golf course. So she was really busy and she had a lot of people in her life and she was doing a lot of things.
Right.
So who would have there wouldn't have been a lot of people who would have known where to find her at 5:30 in the morning. And also she was moving that day. And for me, this is probably the most heartbreaking, is that her parents were actually on their way to come pick her up and move her back home. And that didn't happen. But to the facts of the case, so I went to the parking lot where she was kidnapped. And I was surprised by the layout. It's kind of this semicircle situation. So it wouldn't have been difficult to park close to where you live. And it would have been maybe a 60-second walk, depending on how full the parking lot was from where her apartment might have been. And then I went, and so there are buildings. There are about 30 buildings scattered around the parking lot. And I went with David. And I just tried any door, and it just opened right up. And when you go in on the landing, there were 4 units per building. And there were 2 on the bottom and 2 on the top and a little stairwell. And so given that it was December 20th in Oklahoma and it was only 15 degrees, I'm wondering if somebody wasn't waiting for her. So a crime like this, it's either a crime of opportunity or it's premeditated. And so what I mean by a crime of opportunity is that somebody, like just some random terrible person, would have had to have just been in the parking lot at 5:30 in the morning before the sun came up with his gun and his shoelaces, right? Because we know that Juli was tied up with a pair of shoelaces and they didn't come from her. So whoever tied her up with the shoelaces already had them on him. And he would have had to have kidnapped her in that 60 to maybe 90 seconds it would have taken her to park her car and get to her apartment. And you can logically deduce some things about that situation. We know that she'd been out all night with her friends. She was out playing Monopoly. She had just gone to the Kettle for a very late dinner. And then she had driven her friend to the airport. She probably wanted to go pee because, she's 5'2", and our bladders aren't that big. She's about my height, actually. So there's always the drinking and then the subsequent peeing. So you would assume 15-degree weather, she wasn't hanging out in the parking lot waiting for something terrible to happen. She probably went straight to her apartment where someone forced her back into the car and then took her to Lake Stanley Draper. So that to me suggests a stalker. And maybe I'm a little biased here because I know what it's like to be a girl in college, a bit of an athlete, a performer. You attract flies. The flies are attracted to everything. And I also had a stalker in college, maybe more than one. But the other thing that made me really think that she had a stalker was the testimony of her roommate, who said that they received several harassing phone calls from the local penitentiary. I believe that's Lexington Penitentiary. And so that made me think, if somebody's locked up in a penitentiary and they're still making phone calls, harassing phone calls to Juli or her roommate, we don't even know, it could have been her roommate that had a stalker. Maybe we're looking for somebody who was locked up in the penitentiary, but was released sometime in December. And then, of course, I told you last night that I built the rest of the profile based on the crime scene evidence, excluding the DNA, because I have issues with the DNA, but we'll get to that in a second. They found a size 9 shoe print at the lake by her body, by Juli's body. And you may or may not know this, but I work in film. And so part of film is costuming. And you just pick up these weird things along the way. But as it turns out, a person's height is generally correlated to their shoe size. So with Anthony Sanchez being 6'1", he doesn't wear a size 9 shoe. There are very few men who wear a size 9 if they're 6'1". And in fact, you can vouch for me on this. How tall are you?
5'7", and I wear about a 9.
Uh-huh. So as I told you last night, we're looking for someone about 5'7" to 5'9" who would fit a 5'9" or a size 9 shoe. And somebody locked up at the Lexington Penitentiary and released. Now, I was thinking probably late December. But then also you have to understand, with Juli about to move away, whoever was stalking her, that was his last chance to get her.
So just proceeding on. So if this person, this stalker idea, somebody from Lexington Penitentiary, if they would have had to have been released before December the 20th,
of course,
and they would have had to have been there at the same time that these phone calls were made.
Yes.
So just out of curiosity, have you found anybody that would fit that profile?
I believe I have.
And so there was multiple people mentioned at trial, specifically Tony and Copeland Reynolds. Have you come across them? What are your thoughts on them?
You know, being a part of the investigation, there's not a whole lot I can say. But those two have been looked at. And I'd be, you might be onto something, is all I can say there. Certainly one of those two was incarcerated at the time and did fit the height profile that I came up with. And one of them may have had a very long and violent criminal history. But at this point, without looking further into the DNA, it's not really an avenue we can pursue.
So let me ask you this. So with, like I said, Tony Copeland's name comes up repeatedly. It comes up at trial. It comes up afterwards. And it seems like, as a potential suspect, there are many potential suspects, but as a potential suspect, I guess I'm just trying to say there's a reason that his name comes up. Obviously, there's a reason that his name is bantered about even right now. But I will say this, I think it's important to say that there were a lot of suspects. But another question that I have is, do you feel like these alternative suspects, someone like Tony Copeland, were properly vetted or investigated by Anthony's defense team?
Oh, no. I mean, we already know. I mean, if you live anywhere near the state of Oklahoma or have ever followed the news in the last several months, all you have to do is look to the case of Richard Glossop. Richard Glossop he's going on his 3rd trial now. And Silas Lyman was his defense attorney at trial. And he was also Anthony Sanchez's defense attorney. So it's hard to imagine that as many times as Mr. Lyman's cases have been thrown out and retried for ineffective counsel, that he suddenly got really good in the case of Anthony Sanchez, who is on death row for a crime with nothing but DNA evidence.
Yeah, it seems like there are multiple people who were simply not looked at. I mean, not the least of which, of course, is somebody that we've spent a lot of time pushing back on, particularly because he confessed to the crime, or pushing back with, I guess is a better way of saying it. And that's Glenn Sanchez. saying that here is this person who, has this horrifically violent past, and unquestionably an abuser of women, unquestionably an abuser of Anthony himself, who certainly fits the profile. But it's important to also note, hold on, I'll come back to that. It's important to also note that Glenn isn't the only possibility. I think that the news media, when we mentioned or pushed back and said maybe it's Glenn, that was very sensational, and a lot of that has stuck in terms of people talking about it over and over again. But it does seem like there are other possibilities.
So as you know, I have never been on board with the Glenn Sanchez theory.
Right.
I agree that he was a terrible human being. And was he capable of maybe doing such a thing? Probably he was. But was he hanging around Juli's parking lot at 5:30 in the morning for no reason? I just don't think he had that kind of initiative. And of course, my biggest concern about that whole narrative was that it looked desperate. And the evidence alone is enough. As much as I would love to solve this crime for the sake of Juli, more than anyone, and her family, her parents, I mean, I think of them every day. But we don't need to just guess. The evidence will tell us. And the evidence is already telling us that it's probably not Anthony Sanchez. I mean, obviously, you know what my concerns about the DNA are, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a moment. Sorry. Trying not to get worked up.
No, it's all good. I think that I think it's important. I mean, to be honest, I have a different opinion. I think that it's in my mind, it's more than likely that it was Glenn Sanchez.
Why?
But and I can go into that in a second. But the point is that there's not uniformity of everybody who's engaging this case. I mean, there are differences of opinion, and that in those differences of opinion, there is one solid opinion that this case, it doesn't make sense for Anthony Sanchez to be the killer. Now, as far as Glenn goes, I'll hop into that really quick, and then I don't want to get into dissecting Glenn, but I will say that the part that is most meaningful to me is the way that he lived his life afterwards. The fact that he was consistently going and hiding his DNA and paranoid and those types of things. And also the fact that he confessed. With that said, again, I don't want to go down that road, but I do think, again, that there are different opinions. What I am interested in getting at before we get too far along is the DNA. As somebody who has spent time with DNA, spent time, engaging, I mean, certainly I'm not gonna, I know that you're not this Harvard trained geneticist, but at the same time, you're somebody who has engaged this material on a pretty significant level. What are your thoughts there? What have you found?
Well, it appears, to really oversimplify it, it appears that the DNA profile that the analyst came up with back in 2000-ish, the year 2000, it appears to be contaminated with the victim's DNA. And that's not uncommon. See, let's imagine, for example, that we're trying to do a rape kit. And in the case of a rape kit, the we're looking for seminal fluid, but in the vaginal vault. And so what we're talking about is a situation where the female DNA in the vaginal vault far outnumbers the seminal fluid. So it is the job of the analyst to separate the female DNA from the male DNA in order to get a profile of a DNA profile of the man, right? That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
How else could you get it if you don't separate it? Otherwise, you'd have a mixed profile.
Mm-hmm.
So they found 3 semen samples at the crime scene. And it's really important to note that the coroner did not say that there was any internal deposits of semen. They only found it on her clothing. And I'll get back to that issue in a moment. So the first thing to understand is that semen DNA is not time-stamped. If you find a profile, there is no way to know how long it has been there. There are clues, and that's also important. So they found three semen deposits, 1 in her underwear, 2 on the leotard that was discarded by her body, but 3 on her pajama bottoms that were still in her car. And see, that to me made me question where this semen may have actually come from. But all that aside, when they ran the DNA on the pajama bottoms, they only got a partial profile, which is fine. That happens. But if I were to start talking about alleles and loci, should I explain that first?
No, I mean, I think that it's okay to
All right.
to
So let's just
a brief explanation, but I don't think it's necessarily go into
all right.
too
So
much.
I'll really simplify this, and hopefully we can get some viewers here that have really good experience with DNA, that might be experts themselves, that will weigh in. So to really simplify it, when you're looking for a DNA profile, in this case, eventually they were looking for 32 alleles.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found on the pajama bottoms, I think it was 9. It was either 7 or 9. I should have looked that up before we had this. All the alleles but 1 matched Juli Busken. And so what that tells us is that when they went to separate the semen from her DNA, the machine didn't work. It was a malfunction. And you know what? That happens. So when they went to separate the female DNA from male DNA, they only got 1 allele that did not match Juli Busken. It didn't work. So with that in mind, using the same machine and the same analysts, they went and they looked at the leotard and the underwear. And what they found there, out of the 32 alleles, now you want to subtract 2 of those because those are sex chromosomes, so we're actually just looking at 30 alleles. 9 of those were an exact match to Juli Busken. 9 out of 30, which is almost 30%. But then when you start looking, so alleles are grouped into pairs. And I'm really simplifying this, and a lot of experts are going to take issue with how I'm simplifying it. But at the end of the day, this is what it is. So we've got, let's say, 15 spots, excluding the sex chromosomes, 15 spots that we're looking at. And within those 15 spots, we're looking at 2 alleles per spot. So, and those are called loci, and we'll just go, that's like Latin for location, to, again, really simplify it. So it's kind of weird when you see that 3 of those locations are an exact match to the victim. And we already know that on the first test that, well, I don't know if it was the first test, but on one of the tests that they ran on the pajama bottoms, the machine just didn't, it couldn't separate the semen from Juli Busken's DNA. And I believe that's what happened again, is that it simply was unable to separate these 3 loci from Juli. And then as well as there were 3 more alleles within other loci. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
I'm trying as simply as possible without
No, I think it's good.
going into a bunch of science. And so then that begs the question is, could there be a 30% match between Juli Busken and Anthony Sanchez? So I went and I asked a geneticist, a doctor of genetics, who currently works at the VA in Los Angeles. And I was like, hey, what are the odds of two people sharing 30% DNA? And he asked me if they were biologically related. And I said, no, not to my knowledge. And he said, well, that's the possibility of that happening is less than the population of the entire world. And then if you think about how paternity tests work, so if you want to see if this man is the father of this child, you would look at their forensic DNA profiles and you would hope to find a 50% match between the father and the kid. And if you find about a 50% match, you can say, well, there's a 99.9% chance that this is in fact the father. So if a father is a 50% match to his child, then what does a 30% match mean? So I looked into that a little bit deeper. And when we're talking about siblings, you expect to find somewhere between, let's say, 40% to 67%. That's what siblings tend to share. And full siblings would share entire matching loci. So, but 40% isn't 30%, which is what we have between Anthony and Juli. So I was looking about a half sibling. And a half sibling you would expect to find about 25%. But half siblings don't have matching loci. So that doesn't fit. So just based on that alone, I think there's reason to just double check that the DNA profile that they got in 2000, that was 24 years ago. Also, because there was no internal deposits of semen, there was no penetration. So as much as I am loath to say this without doing further investigation and having another expert, she does not appear to have been raped. And the coroner testified to that. He said that there was no penetration. And to their credit, the attorneys did say, Anthony's attorneys did ask them to throw out the rape charge because there's simply no evidence of it other than some bruising. And if you look at the bruising on the autopsy reports, and also please don't because they're horrible, the thing that caught my attention about the bruising, Jeff, was that she had bruises on one of her thighs. And obviously there were fingerprints, and the prosecution was, they got that part right, that whoever left these bruises on her one thigh, that was from fingerprints. But she was a ballerina, Jeff. Ballerinas get lifted into the air with one hand. That's it's a move called a torch lift, or sometimes a seat lift. And so you would expect to find some bruises on a ballerina, especially one that had just performed a week prior. Simply the rehearsal process, that alone, and I want you to imagine the mechanics of it. Juli Busken was 140 pounds, according to the autopsy report. If you were going to lift an entire human being off the ground with one hand, that is considered an explosive movement that requires momentum. And that's something you have to practice over and over and over again, or you'll drop the ballerina. And that's bad. You don't want to do that during performance. And I don't know if you know this, but I used to be a professional wrestler.
You've done a lot. You've done a lot.
Yeah. So I have been lifted. I've been lifted a lot because at my height and my weight, they love to lift me up and throw me around. And you know what? Sometimes you get a little beat up. Sometimes you get a little bruised. But that comes from being an athlete and being a performer. And so the other bruise that they found on her, the labial bruise, it was 3 centimeters. And so 3 centimeters is about the size of your thumb. So again, when we're talking about lifting a human being into the air, and I know this because once upon a time, former WWE wrestler Al Snow picked me up by my crotch and my chest, held me into the air, and tossed me into a waterfall. Now, I didn't check for bruising afterwards, but I wouldn't be surprised if, I was. So just, if she were any other person, if she wasn't a performer and an athlete, I'd be like, hey, those bruises may have come from sexual assault, and they may have. You know how we could tell, though? There is a way to tell how old a bruising is by the inflammatory cells. So the version of the autopsy that I had did specify that there were chronic inflammatory cells, but there wasn't enough information on my version to really figure it out. I did have a surgeon take a look at it because, again, I'm not an expert. I just kind of have an inquisitive mind, and I know from making films that a story, you got to put all the pieces together so they make sense, and if they don't make sense, you have to keep looking. So anyway, I asked a surgeon, and long story short, her interpretation was that these bruises are not consistent with what you expect to find in a rape victim. So if we could tell the ages of the bruising, then we would know for certain if it came from sexual assault on the day of the murder or if it was from rehearsal.
Gotcha. Well, so we've got about 7 minutes left, and and I wanted to get to, before we wrap it up, I wanted to get to Anthony himself. The state's narrative was that here is this guy out here breaking into cars, stealing Christmas presents, and he sees this, ballerina. It's a crime of opportunity. He, ties her up and gets her, into her car and takes her and rapes her. Part of the issue that I've consistently wondered about is there is a significant amount of time missing between hearing the witness hearing the screams at 5:30 and ultimately the Merriman sighting later on. Can't remember exactly what time, but
6:45 to 7 a.m. she was on her way to work.
Something along those lines, right? So that leaves, it's about a 20-minute drive from.
It is exactly a 20-minute drive. David and I did that drive.
Yeah, and I've done that drive too. It's around a 20-minute drive, which means that there is a significant amount of time missing.
Yes.
2 questions before we wrap it up. One, what doesn't make sense about the state's narrative with the Christmas presents? And 2, where's the missing time? And it seems to me that if you're going to convict someone of murder and sentence them to death, you need to be able to give some sort of an account for everything that happened. And there seems to be a significant amount of time where they have no idea what happened. So first, a couple of minutes on the Christmas presents and a couple of minutes on the time.
So first of all, a person who's stealing Christmas presents from cars, even if that is true, which we don't know that it is, that's a very different criminal profile from somebody who is raping and murdering women. It seems to me that he could have just run away if he was afraid of being caught stealing Christmas presents, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge escalation in terms of criminal stuff.
Right.
And then also, was he stealing Christmas presents with a gun and shoelaces? It's the shoelaces. It is the shoelaces that really gets me. This is what convinces me that this was a crime of this was premeditated. The fact that Juli was moving away that same day, whoever did this would have never had another opportunity in Oklahoma to kidnap her. So yeah, it just doesn't make sense. And also, in the years that he was free afterwards, where are the rest of the women that he murdered?
Right. So quickly jump into the time. What's going on in that time? I'm sure the state would say that she was being raped, but we don't have any evidence that she was raped. So what do
Right.
you think? What do you think was going on during that time?
Well, if there was no sexual assault, and I don't have enough evidence to say that there wasn't, I'd really like to get my hands on the homicide book and the to see the actual police work that was done. And I'm yes, it's a whole other story. My guess would be, so stalkers, either they have they had a relationship with the victim that is in their own mind inflated, or there's no relationship with the victim, and that's inflated to a point where it's real. So if this was a stalker that kidnapped her, he likely was trying to plead with her to have this relationship with her that she knew nothing about, or that she wasn't interested in having. And whatever it was that he didn't get the reaction he was looking for. And the other thing was taking her to this lake. A lake is a public place, and a lake is arguably a romantic place. And as you've said, you've made that drive. When you were making that drive, Jeff, how many spots did you see where you could pull over and shoot someone and leave them there?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely thought about that. It's definitely possible.
Yeah. So why there? Why a lake where you expect people to find? And in fact, just hours later, there was a fisherman. Don't ask me what a fisherman was doing in freezing weather. Can you fish in freezing weather?
I'm not sure. I've thought about that too. I've thought about that fisherman must have been very cold. So it does seem that there are a variety of elements in this case that points to someone other than Glenn, or a random suspect, or even when I say random, excuse me, a suspect that has not been identified or engaged, and also a suspect that could have known her very well. We're less than a minute, and so I wanted to wrap it up and just say, Tara, thank you so much, and I appreciate your work on all this case. I appreciate the conversation the words that you've had with Anthony himself, and we both very much believe that Anthony is innocent, and that's what we continue to work towards, is stopping this execution and freeing him. But we also are interested in people taking the time to realize that there's a lot of nuance in this case, and there's a lot of different ideas and thoughts that we have come up with, and a lot of ideas and thoughts that investigators didn't come up with. Go ahead. I'll let you have the last word. Go ahead. This is part 2 with Tara Cardinal, and we're going to be talking about the shoelaces found at the scene. Tell me about it.
Well, it all comes down to this. We don't know for certain that the seminal profile that they found on Juli Busken's clothing came from the murderer or from possibly a lover. And there's reason to believe that these deposits were older than the crime. So what we do know is the shoelaces are the only thing the murderer touched for certain. And the analysts did attempt to get a profile off of those shoelaces back in as early as 2000 and maybe as late as 2003. But unfortunately, she wasn't able to get a full profile. Part of that reason could have been simply that, well, one, she tested the knot instead of the ends of the laces, which is where you would grasp if you were tying someone up. But also technology has vastly improved in the last 20 years since it's been tested. And there's absolutely no reason not to test an item that has never been properly tested when we know it's the only thing the murderer touched. For certain. That's it.
Yeah, I was fixing to say, I think that's it.
Yeah, that test puts this whole thing to bed. If that profile comes back as Anthony Sanchez, then that's it.